The ledger. On paper, the platform was simple. People clocked in with their phones or a card with a barcode printed in friendly blue. They stacked hours like coins, and those hours bought benches, clinic supplies, new paint for the cinder block pool, a refrigerated case for the food pantry, so milk didn't sour on hot days. A little town with a flattened mill and a tired main street woke up under the hum of fluorescent fixtures and the hiss of fresh coat on old wall. Dig long enough and you hit bedrock. Spend long enough and you hit a ledger. He named it Ledger because he didn't care for clever names. Galen kept odd hours because the people he needed kept odd hours. Teachers after dismissal. Nurses coming off nights with their eyes full of noise. The line crew who took the south switchyard and moved it back from the weeds every June before heat started biting. He rented a narrow storefront between a closed shoe repair and a fishing license kiosk that sold lures shaped like the kind of fish people lied about. The front room smelled like warmed dust, printer dye, coffee that had believed in itself briefly and then stopped. A small fridge hummed with the authority of machines that measure themselves against heat and wind. He used one corner as a desk, a folding table with a tape dispenser, a labeler with a narrow mouth, a terminal that made a cheerful beep when it liked to scan and a different beep when it didn't tea. In the mornings, he counted mugs. He set 4 upside down on the towel to dry, then righted them and looked at the rings the ceramic left on the cloth as if those rings could predict, in the way the tide tables pretended to, what the day would give. Across the street, the traffic light coughed through its cycle. Red for an empty crosswalk, green into a wind. No one walked into this early. Amber that always felt like apology. The receipt printer on the counter ticked as it woke, a little soft motor clearing its throat. He positioned the hand sanitizer where the habitual reach lived and moved the clipboard 5 inches to the left. Because people looked for clipboards in their sleep, and their sleep was better than he was at running bodies through rooms. The barcode scanner nested in his hand. He liked the weight of it, the way he liked the weight of a hammer. Tools tell you where your wrist should be. By 10, the first wave moved through. They stood at the door and put their palms on the glass as if taking the town's temperature. Then came in and did what the town always demanded, signed, offered, waited. He watched hands, because hands said more than faces. Someone whose knuckles had learned to swell came in with 3 hours to donate, and a quiet that suggested they had been awake since 3. He showed her the new project list on the screen: paint the school's back stair, patch the Southfield irrigation line, scrub and wax the small clinic's floors so the gurneys stopped snagging. She tapped her finger on the clinic line and he marked her name in the system. The scanner spoke red to green, a neat translation of person to ledger. In the afternoons, he walked to the civic center where the aquarium sat, the kind of well-meaning installation towns adopt when a donor wants a plaque that sounds like a lullaby. In the atrium, coral plates overlapped like dishes in a careful cupboard, and small fish moved without needing people to understand them. The hospital would have liked the tank, but had chosen a mural instead. Less plumbing, more permission. Ledger partnered with the Civic Center because the volunteer coordinator there had a voice that could cut through crowds when it wanted, and a gentle hand for people who had learned to flinch. He checked the kiosk, the power strip under it, the little router that shared their network with both the aquarium and the vending machines that refused dollar bills after 9. He learned the tank's noises without wanting to. The return pump eased up and down with small adjustments, as if listening to weather. The skimmer coughed. The moonlights came on like breath. The small handheld monitor for the water's chemistry drew a line he had taught himself to read. ORP, redox potential, good when flat, bad when it went staircase. He didn't know enough to say why, only that when it walked steps, it argued with itself. He placed his palm on the glass sometimes, without quite knowing he'd done it, a habit people have around certain surfaces, as if warmth will register back from the other side and absolve them of something. On the Thursday, the first anomaly arrived, He was alone with the tank. The coordinator had taken her lunch to the steps by the fountain because the air in the atrium hung wrong, not humid exactly. Not cool either. A conditioned flavor that tasted of floor polish and the sugar from a fruit cart someone had pushed through at noon. He wrote notes on the clipboard, requests for carpentry help, a plea from the pantry for shelving, his pen doing its click-click ratchet at the end of every line. The handheld on the ledge beside the tank made a small noise and drew an exact little staircase on its screen, neat steps, as if it had heard a door open underwater. "Fine," he said to it, because machines like being spoken to as if they are listening. He lifted the labeler to print time labels for the new intake cards. The strip slid out on its own. No button. The old block caps belonged to nobody he knew. Do not greet. The tape was warm, as if someone had palmed it. He set it face down under the leaflet holder. He put his hand flat on the glass and held it there longer than felt ordinary, as if to make a show of not being impressed by tricks. On the inside of the pane, 5 ovals and a thumb appeared at child height and dried from the edges in. He took his hand away. The print on his side cooled with the stubbornness of a person not wanting to return an offered hand. He stared at his own palm. It was clean. It was always clean. He wasn't one of those people who handled fish and then forgot soap. He looked at the carpet by the drain in the corner of the atrium. Salt caught the light in a way that made a heel come and go when he wasn't looking at it directly. He said nothing, which became the habit. He wrote down the skimmer S noise and the pump S number and the row of new sign-ups with their hours promised 4258. He let the tape live where he had tucked it. He told himself that messages float through buildings and sometimes you happen to be the shelf they land on. At first, the changes were the kind the human eye is happy to chalk up to fatigue. Volunteers came back different by a hair, smiles running high and tight as if faces had been sewn at the cheekbones, eyes that had not been tired and were now tired but could not explain from what. The unnecessary apology some people carry through doorways like a duffel. He rationalized. Work is exercise under fluorescent lights. Exercise and fluorescent lights conspire to make you think your body is a borrowed thing. He slept and woke and ate and forgot he had eaten. The scanner at the desk began to beep with a small delay after the squeeze, like a laugh that arrives out of time. He called the manufacturer, and a person with a soft voice said this was normal for devices on a shared network after a period of intense uptake. And the phrase comforted him the way official phrases do. He hung up, and a siren tried out the street once, unnecessarily. The town found a point to gather around and then used it as hard as the town could. Children in bright shirts filled the manila folders with handprints. Old men asked for chairs instructions. The food pantry took down 8 shelves and put up 12. The baseball field S-hose sprang a leak, and Ledger bought tape and clamps and 3 pairs of gloves with lined palms. The leaked water did not smell like the county's water. It smelled like someone had been boiling potatoes and thrown out the water 3 days ago. He told himself the hose had held onto someone else's life and was letting go of it slowly. The first advisory came in as a banner at the bottom of the town A's page. Increased demand on the water district. Low pressure possible. Please report any discoloration. The pressure in his office sink stepped down 1 notch and then went back to work. On his way home that night, the traffic light at Riverside and Main went dead, and nobody knew the rule for a dead light anymore. He waited and then slid through on courtesy, because courtesy is a rule that survives outages. He woke before dawn, with the fridge chewing softly, and the memory of someone pressing 5 fingers to the glass and waiting for him opposite, as polite as a person not wanting to startle anybody. He washed his face and leaned toward the mirror to shave and blinked, and in the blink the mirror wasn't too wrong so much as thinner than it should have been. His face lived there. His eyes lived there. On his second pass, his face lived there slightly less. He laughed because morning does not forgive melodrama, He shaved, he dressed, he took his old coat from the peg and told himself it was still too cold for anything but old coats. He said good morning to the traffic light when it remembered its job and felt ridiculous for deciding the light S green belonged to him. With Ledger thriving, people called who had not called in years. City councillors with biographies that included words like stewardship. A woman from the regional paper who needed a photo of a volunteer scraping paint in a doorway, with their tongue stuck out slightly because effort photographs better when faces offer it up. A guy from a platform with a name that sounded like a cheerful disease, asking if Ledger wanted to partner on micro grants as incentives, which meant paying people in coupons for hours spent. He declined the platform and sent the reporter to the clinic instead of to the aquarium because the clinic had better light. He scanned and filed and watched the receipt printer extrude its thin paper tongue. Thermal paper turns grey the way skin does in old photographs. He handed out coffee in mugs with a hairline crack you could feel with your lip if you were paying attention. He kept the labeler in the drawer because he did not want its opinion in daylight. Sometimes, when he was tired, the printer lost its line and the receipts read in a half-language of missing characters, like someone had taken each word and lifted a letter from the middle. He didn't keep those slips. He folded them and put them under the mug until they became the thickness of the mug, and the mug learned to sit better on the counter. On the second Tuesday, the Civic Center posted a sign, "Water fountain out of order." People who had grown up with bottled water didn't mind, but the ones who had promised themselves tap water forever frowned at the blue bag over the fountain, S stainless mouth. The aquarium breathed as it always breathed. The handheld monitor drew its line. When the steps came, they came the way particular hours arrive. The hallway gets long, and the air near the floor cools. And something you learned in childhood about doors says, go back. At 0312, the return pump eased 1% higher. The surface fell, then rose, as if someone had stepped down into the water and climbed out on the far side. The school of fish opened a lane and closed it, as if the lane had belonged to something and now didn't tee. The feed bar above the water twitched and clicked a single pellet that never fell. Back in life support, a tidy closet with a pleated filter like a concertina, and an electrical panel that had seen enough. An alarm log printed a line the firmware didn't T-own, served. Under it, the touchscreen redrew the system and added a ghost loop labeled home, then blinked and forgot. He watched it forget. Forgetting is one of the braver tricks machines perform. He told himself not to tell anyone. He did not enjoy the kind of look men offer other men when machines misbehave. He started to sleep in 2 segments and began to think this was an improvement. After dinner, he would drift for 3 hours and dream of numbers rising, shallow, like fish at the surface. At midnight, he woke and sat at the kitchen table and the fridge hummed and stopped and hummed, and the whole apartment breathed in those pulses. He sorted receipts. He started putting them into a shoebox because boxes turn anxiety into furniture. He heard distant sirens making the curve around the mill and then losing interest. The sirens kept their old promises somewhere else. People began to stand in certain ways. The volunteers who weeded the verge along the old brickworks pressed their palms to their hips when they rested. The way a hip bone sits under skin is a fact. The way skin registers heat is a fact. The look a body has when it believes heat will come and it does not is also a fact, if less cheerful. He offered chairs. They declined chairs. Everyone declined chairs because declining chairs had become a sign of competence. Their smiles changed. That's what he was willing to say to himself. They stretched upward and met their eyes less often, like someone had told them gently, "You will be happier if you consider smiling more a matter of policy than conversation." He understood policy. He had written 4 that month because the county requested them. Safety with ladders, heat advisories. a form for reporting small injuries like cracked shins and scraped knuckles, and language around working alone that tried not to sound like an accusation, but failed. In the grocery, he ran into a woman who had painted the school's stairwells. She held 2 bags, and the bags' handles had cut into the cups of her fingers, leaving crescents of impressed plastic that did not blanch when she lifted her fingers to show him. She told him, in a voice one uses at funerals, that she was sleeping less and waking to hose water in her mouth, the taste of it, that particular bitter that belongs to long rubber. He told her about hydration, because hydration is a word that can pass for caring when you can to fix anything else. The town's projects thrived. The gazebo learned a new roof made of donated wood. Someone fixed the antique clock in the municipal building so that it stopped at the top of the hour with a clean thwack instead of wavering. The crosswalks were bright again. White paint on asphalt has a smell that lives somewhere under hair. He walked through these proofs and felt proud, and admitted to himself he was proud in a way that felt like standing on a ladder with no one at the foot. He published the metrics because that was what he had promised. Hours tallied, projects completed, cost avoided. People read them like weather, looked up at the sky, nodded to themselves, put on or took off a sweater. Whispers began. Not at him. Not about him exactly. People leaned near the desk with their receipts and said, "Lo, have you?" and then said nothing, because saying nothing is the easiest form of privacy. One man who mowed the median for the 3 miles nobody drove said he'd seen a person walking at 4 in the morning next to the river, where there is no path, hands busy with nothing. And when he'd looked again, the shape had been a stand of knotweed and water making a shoulder of itself around the bend. He laughed. His laugh was wrong, even if his mouth tried to season it with ease. He asked if he could count the mowing as hours, even though he'd done it 30 years without counting. Galen said yes, because Ledger's purpose was to link hands, not to tell anyone their hands had been late to a party. There were jokes at first, and then there weren't. Everyone used the same phrase without agreeing to it. The collector. The collector was a shape that stood at the ends of hallways. It was someone at meetings, with their back to the room, unhelpfully still. It might have been the undertaker's boy doing a fashion with his hair. It might have been the new doctor in a coat with a pocket full of absent-mindedness. A 12-year-old at the library drew it on a sticky note, a bottle with a knot tied in its neck and the word essence in letters that tried to be sharp. Their mother grinned, kissed their head, plucked the note away, then stood for a second too long looking at her own face in the bathroom mirror. In the Civic Center's restroom, someone had written with a finger in the dust along the top edge of the mirror frame, "Do not greet." He wiped it away. The next day it was there again. The dust settled in narrow lines, as if drawn by a string rather than a finger, each letter clean-edged by gravity. He wiped it. The day after that, the letters were there, and the rag he used to wipe smeared the dust, but left the words legible. He emptied the towel disposal, and the empty bin made a sound like a throat clearing. The advisory changed shape. The water district wrote about inline valves and drawdown and transient taste events, which sounded to him like a public apology that had gone to the dry cleaner and come back with a crease where you don't want one. They closed the fountains in 6 buildings. The librarian put a jug on the floor by the desk with a hand-lettered sign that said, "Please use your own cup." Someone wrote under it with a pencil, "Or do not." On Friday night, he went to the Civic Center to fix a network hiccup. In life support, the closet with its prioritized hum, he found the log printer on and the touchscreen doing its helpful animation, redrawing the system, the pipe loop, and the return loop, the curious ghost loop that labeled itself home, then blinked and forgot. He stared until his eyes began to measure things that weren't there, and forced himself to turn off the screen and on again, the oldest curative. In the tank, late, the moonlights were off, but the dull glow moved through coral like a coat carried in careful hands. He pressed his palm against the glass because it had become the reflex that replaced prayer. On the inside, 5 ovals and a thumb appeared at child height and dried from the edges in. He remembered being a boy and letting the bathroom mirror fog and drawing circles in it to make faces. He remembered the cane chair on the apartment balcony giving way under his father's weight one spring, and the way his father laughed as he fell, and the way he had not laughed the year later, when the chair gave again with a different meaning. He remembered none of this with any interest until the handprint reached his height too and met his palm and stayed as warm as a person. At the top of the hour, a line printed at his desk across town. Served. He found it the next morning rolled against the receipt printer's back wall as if embarrassed by itself. He kept it. He did not know where to put paper you do not trust and also cannot throw away. His shoebox gained a second shoebox. He did not check the tape in the labeler for ink so often. Instead, he taped its mouth shut and placed it in a drawer under mugs because mugs had weight enough to defeat tricks. On Saturday, he avoided mirrors. He told himself this was about time. He was growing tired of his own face in ways that did not belong to any age. At a stoplight, he checked his reflection in the windshield of a truck and saw himself in that pale way glass gives you back a man with a face that belonged to a man. Not handsome exactly, but not incorrect. Late that night, he washed up at the civic center because the sink at his office had decided to make everything smell like copper, and it was easier to put his hands in the building's water than in his own. He leaned over the porcelain, and the mirror above it didn't quite refuse him, but it made him wait. On the second breath, he noticed not the absence of his face, but the presence of a darker shape where faces belonged. It was not a hole, but it behaved the way a hole behaves, collected light and gave none back. It smiled with a mouth that didn't belong to shadows. He made no sound. There was no one to hear one. He backed out of the bathroom and leaned his shoulder against the cool tile and stayed as long as it took for the fluorescent buzz to become a tone he could hold in his head. He re-entered and the mirror was regular. He did not test it by making a face. He was done with invitations. He washed his hands with the public soap that smells like airports and wiped them on the rough brown paper that throws splinters. And he liked the splinters because they were comprehensible. By Sunday, people had stopped bringing jokes. They brought facts with their receipts. "I forgot my neighbor's name for a minute," a woman said. And he didn't ask if she remembered it later, because forgetting is not his to remedy, and the word neighbor has a weight that should not be lifted with questions. "I wake up and my teeth feel heavy," a man said, and he said, "Drink water," and heard the ridiculousness and said, "Eat something with salt," and the man did, and then came back and looked unchanged. A boy refused to look into the aquarium and held his mother's sleeve the way a drowning person might hold a rope. She tried to tell him about fish, and he told her the water had a person in it, and she said everything has people in it, and he said this one doesn't want to meet us. He moved the kiosk. He moved it away from the tank. The coordinator raised an eyebrow because moving the kiosk meant moving an extension of her authority, and she didn't like giving up territory, even to him. He shrugged, as if shrugging added to the credibility of his need. He told her he wanted to be under the skylight because people scanned better in light. She allowed this because light improves everything for free. He worked longer and began speaking less. The volunteers accreted into projects that didn't quite need them. The platform's success attracted people who wanted the success to belong to them. A councilman asked for exported numbers in a format he called universal, and meant by universal that it could be pasted into speeches. A school board member asked if hours could be applied to a teacher's lounge facelift that had failed twice before to interest anyone. A man who had once lectured him about the moral hazard of making kindness transactional now wanted to know if you could underwrite hours for a friend who had a felony and difficulty working. And the question was not unkind. It just asked to be answered by a world that never had to be this literal about its favors. He pushed back gently because pushing harder turns people into walls. He let the platform grow because growth was the only sound the town heard without flinching. Every night the receipts made their little crib of paper. Every night the box under the counter expanded its idea of what it might hold. The whispers did not stop. They found a more efficient route. People told him the collector spoke with no voice and made offers by standing near. Payments went out through the app and came back through sleep. You woke with less of something that might be yours, and you gave it a name because unnamed things widen rooms until you can find the doors. One word for it was essence. He had never been much for the word. He found a part of himself looking to see if his shadow had grown thinner and laughed out loud when he had that thought alone in his kitchen, and then stopped laughing when his laugh sounded like the scanner's polite delayed chirp. At the end of that month, the platform took an award that came with a paperweight heavy enough to dent the counter if placed wrongly. The county executive presented it. A woman took photos and asked him to put his hand on the paperweight as if he had a personal relationship with gravity. On the second shot, she asked him to smile, and he did, and a part of his face refused, not out of defiance but out of unfamiliarity with the request. He saw the photo later and tried to recognize himself and managed the way you manage to recognize handwriting you loved when it has changed. He slept and woke and put his feet in shoes and listened for the sound a building makes when someone opens a door at night and steps in very carefully and then steps out again, leaving the air full of the sentence they had meant to say but had decided wisely to keep. When the call came from the town's only clinic, he walked there because walking arranged him into the version of himself that could visit a building where he had no reasons to be. The new floor wax he had purchased left a small, sweet odor clinging to the underlids of his eyes. "We want to pay," the nurse said, sliding an envelope across the counter, the way people slide bad news. "I know it isn't that kind of thing, but the board said, take it. You can call it sponsor money. I asked that it be cash because..." She could not say because in a clinic the word because is the first brick in a wall and no one wants to find out how high it is. He said, "I'll log it," and put the envelope into his coat where he knew his fingers would find it too often. He went to the restroom. He did not look up. He washed his hands twice. The day he finally broke was a day without anything in it. The scanner had been fine. The printer had been fine. The advisory feed was quiet like a dog that has decided to sleep on the porch instead of bark. He stood in his office at 9 and turned his head toward the little mirror on the wall above the sink because there was a powder on his cheek he had thought was flour and realized he had not cooked in a week. He looked. The mirror gave him his face. And then the room breathed once in and once out, and he was not there. It was exactly that plain. The shape in the glass was a polite vacancy with a grin fed into it, the kind of grin a person scribbles on a napkin to make a circle into a face. He put his hand to his own cheek and felt the powder. He put his hand to the glass. The glass was warm enough to be a person's shoulder. The emptiness in the mirror smiled wider until it was no longer a smile. He stepped back, and the emptiness held its ground. In this way, people sometimes envy in one another. He laughed, or thought he did. The room did not record a laugh. He went and sat in the stairwell because stairwells know what to do with bodies that cannot finish sentences. The light above hummed old ballast song. The air smelled of old mop and the lemon that lives in cleaning agents made for institutions, so that the feeling of clean enters your head by way of your nose, and you forgive the rest. He sat. He stood. He went back into the office, and the mirror offered him back. He did not check the mirror again that hour. He went to the civic center because the habit of checking on machines survives feelings. The tank water showed him nothing proud. The handheld screen drew no steps. The log printer was asleep in the way machines sleep, ready to report even while unaware of what is being asked. The labeler on the display shelf fed out a strip without a finger on the trigger, sticky and warm. Do not greet. He put it in his pocket like a child's leaf, knowing it would turn brittle and functionless by evening. He worked. He worked the next day. He worked the day after. He learned a trick: to hand towels with both hands, palms up, as if handing a warm animal. And the person receiving felt briefly their own life supported. The scanner sometimes jumped the gun and beeped before he squeezed it. The printer sometimes printed numbers that were his without being his. He placed a mug over the labeler in the drawer because the mug had mass, and sometimes mass is an argument you can win. He learned to ignore glass. He learned to take messages from people's shoulders. He learned that certain hours, 03.12, fantastically, the hour a pump eases a percent higher, betray the intentions of buildings. He slept between 3 and 4 by force to keep that hour from speaking to him. He let the fridge hum and did not assign it language. He put his fingers under the tap and read the water temperature and told himself he would not develop opinions about water. The platform kept on. People, hours stacked, and went out to the library in the form of new shelves, and to the school in the form of doorknobs that do not trap children when they are unsure. He found he could be proud in sections and leave a section blank for something else. He tried not to read the lowercase voices online that said he had turned care into coin. He tried not to read the uppercase ones that said the town had been saved by an app. He tried to be a person who moved receipts from one place to another and kept jars of pens full. At some point he realized he had stopped greeting. He had stopped calling people by name when they entered. He had stopped raising his hand when he saw someone he knew across the street, because raising hands is the oldest invitation, and invitations make rooms tilt. He nodded instead, the weak compromise of the coward and the minimalist. He walked past reflective surfaces as if they belonged to other people and tried to keep his mouth from tightening at their edges. As winter started to pick at the town's seams, he woke to a square of taped paper at the office door. An advisory, generic and officious, ventilation check next quarter. He put it with the other papers that meant someone might someday enter with a meter and a clipboard and ask air to testify. He called the number at the bottom and left a message with only his name and address. He did not say, "Sometimes my mirror does not return me." He did not say, "My volunteers have started to carry their smiles like ladders they are tired of." He said nothing because nothing is a cleaner that gets in under the labels and dissolves the glue. When the inspector came, shirt with a logo indistinguishable from other logos, handheld reader held like a museum brochure, he ran the meter along the vents and wrote down numbers every time the meter beeped and didn't write anything when it didn't tee. He looked into the stairwell and nodded as if nodding were certification. He opened the cabinet under the sink and closed it again. He asked to see the back room, and Galen showed him the nothing that was in it, and he wrote in his pads that the nothing had been seen. He thanked him for his compliance. He smelled like new ducting and hand cream. When the man left, Galen put his hand flat on the door and waited for the steel S cold to become his, and it did, and the transfer was intelligible, and he let that be a good thing. The worst days were when success drew him into rooms he had to pretend were meant for people like him. The foundation across the county line wanted to hear about scaling. The regional magazine wanted a profile with a photo of him looking up a street that had recently been painted into a state safer for ankles. He said the words because the words were expected. He watched himself in windows that did not betray him. He kept his hands near mugs so that he could pick one up without looking like that had been his only purpose now for some time. At night in his apartment, he sometimes pressed both hands against the wall, free of pictures. He pressed until the bones of his palms made it through to the cinder block and the wall. Cool returned into him and traveled up his forearms and argued with the heat his blood made on its own this time of year. He kept the towel warmer he'd stolen from the clinic. Not stolen, borrowed with permission, on low, and sometimes when sleep didn't like him. He folded a towel and placed it across his eyes, and let the weight tell his body where it began and ended. He dreamed of receipts that became paper fish that lived in the shoebox until the shoebox became a tank, and the tank asked to be fed, and the feed bar clicked a single pellet that never fell. He dreamed of the ghost loop labeled home and woke laughing, which frightened him because laughter that arrives without a clear sentence attached to it feels borrowed. He drank water that tasted like nothing and appreciated nothing in a way he had never before. He made one change. He took down the mirror above the sink in his office and replaced it with a corkboard and put up the drawings children had left behind. A heart with too many chambers. A hand with 5 thumbs, a house sitting in a river and not hurrying to leave. He did this without announcement, and it made everything easier. When he needed to see if there was powder on his cheek, he used his phone, which had a camera that had decided long ago to be kind to him and was not likely to change its mind now. He went sometimes to the civic center late because building air has moods, and sometimes they ask for company. The aquarium learned to be an object again when no one asked it for metaphors. He pressed his palm to the glass and nothing pressed back, and he let that be a kind of mercy. The handheld monitor drew its line without steps, and the ghost loop did not redraw. The labeler printed only when asked to, and when it did, he printed schedule, stairwell wax, Saturday 9 a.m., and stuck it to the board and brought donuts for the 6 who said yes to that thankless morning. He watched them eat and talk with their mouths full, and felt the word essence leave the room on its own legs. The volunteer who mowed the median came in once and slid an envelope across the counter like a person with a tip in a diner who doesn't know the custom and would like someone to teach it to him gently. "My hours," he said, "for the lights on first. You have a thing that tells them they're on." He meant the timer. He meant the cheap clock in a grey box, wired by a man in a ball cap who had learned electricity by holding one wire and then not wanting to hold it anymore. "We'll put them there," Galen said, and wrote it in. And the man exhaled and said the name of his dog the way people say their children's names when no one asks them to, and left. On a Wednesday, after the first snow had turned to grain on the sidewalks, and then ice, and then entropy, the civic center reopened the water fountain. The blue bag lifted like a body leaving a bed. The sign said, "Out of order removed." Someone drank, and nothing happened. A boy stood at the aquarium and placed his second-hand mitten on the glass, and a handprint rose and met it. And the boy said, "Warm." His mother said, "Everything is warmer at your height." And the boy nodded because nodding is easier than arguing with a person who is trying to love you in public. Galen began to greet again, not reliably, not at distance, but in rooms. He said people's names until his mouth believed he had earned the right. He lifted the mug off the labeler and took the labeler to the civic center and left it there because a machine behaves better in shared custody. He took the tape he had saved, the one that said "Do not greet," and folded it into the liner of his coat pocket where it could turn brittle and crack into harmlessness without being watched. He stopped watching 0312 and slept through it, and the pump did whatever pumps do when men who have nothing to do with pumps let them be. The platform kept on. The projects continued, and the town allowed itself to call what it felt pride. The jokes about the collector went out of fashion. The word essence made a last appearance on a flyer for an art fair and then was chosen over by other words. People learned to talk about tiredness again in their old ways, with recipes and advice about shoes. The scanner returned to making its immediate beep until it lost its mind one day and had to be replaced, and he replaced it and threw the old one in the bin, and nobody wrote about it on any site anywhere. Someone stole the towel warmer. He put a blank space where it had been and found he could live with that. Once, months later, he heard a tiny printer in a closet he no longer visited draw a line and write "served," and he said to no one, "Me too," and went about his day. He stopped counting mugs and started counting the seconds it took to make someone feel the room had been expecting them. He stood sometimes at the aquarium and looked at his reflection with the patience you use with children and dogs. He saw himself enough. He saw a hand rise once to meet his hand from the other side of the glass, and he did not lift his palm. He inclined his head the smallest amount, the way you do for strangers who have done nothing wrong and might yet. Then he turned toward the desk where a receipt waited under the paperweight that had dented the counter, and he read the numbers and he added them to the numbers that came after, and then he went home in the time between red and green, when the light has not quite remembered its own cycle, and you move because trust at last has been put into your legs again.